So here's another great submission from a subscriber. I really loved reading this, and I think you guys are really going to enjoy hearing it. It's pretty detailed and also quite unique. I've not heard of many people combining these two substances. So yeah, I think you're in for a treat with this one. Rue and mushrooms. Context for experience: 19 years old. Gender: male. Body weight: 135 pounds, 60 kilograms. Substances taken: 1.5 grams of Peganum harmala and 2 grams of penis envy psilocybin mushrooms. Background: I was a fairly experienced psychonaut at this point in my life. I started experimenting with psychedelics right after graduating high school. My experience prior to this trip includes being a daily stoner for 4 years, a handful of low-dose DXM trips, probably between 20 to 30 mushroom trips at doses up to about 3.5 grams, somewhere around 40 to 50 LSD trips at doses up to about 400 to 500 micrograms, and 2 mescaline trips in the form of self-prepared San Pedro. I will admit that while this sounds like the record book of a fairly experienced psychonaut, it was in no way a truly sufficient preparation for the experience of which I am about to speak. Though a very personal story, I have grown, processed and learnt a lot from this experience, hopefully for other people to relate to or to learn from. To describe my mindset going into this, I must say, there was no serious preparation or consideration given about what I was planning to do that day. At this point in my life, my mind was, for lack of a better description, absorbed into its own mytho-poetic reality. I had been tripping an extraordinary amount leading up to this, and had far removed my consciousness from sobriety. With only a few exceptions, I tripped almost every single weekend from 1 week after graduating high school until the beginning of my junior year of college. Mostly mushrooms and LSD, sometimes combining them pretty much every weekend. I would only take breaks when it was unobtainable, and I can only remember one particular dry spell in the summer of my freshman year of college that ended up lasting longer than 2 weeks, which ended up actually just prompting me to try San Pedro. Depending on your point of view, I had a problem. I was half loaded all the time, as when I wasn't tripping I was stoned. I was essentially never sober, a dedicated wake and baker, a psychedelic weekend warrior. I was thoroughly disconnected from most people's reality. Studying Spanish and philosophy in college, I never had homework, as mushrooms lended an amazing facility to learning Spanish and studying philosophy. My schoolwork and my psychedelic interests were thoroughly merged, as all surviving lineages utilising the tryptamine hallucinogens are found in Latin American. And studying philosophy was necessary to even have a mental footing in my psychedelic endeavours. It would be fair to say at this point in my life that my mind had become possessed by psychedelics. Reading and listening to unhealthy doses of Terence McKenna, I had stumbled across a reference to a plant that contained the same chemical alkaloids as Banisteriopsis caapi, the ayahuasca vine. I heard him make reference to the plant while mentioning that the outdated name for harmine, telepathine, was named after the plant Peganum harmala, as harmine was first extracted from its seeds before later being discovered in the caapi vine. This was the tidbit of information that sent me down the rabbit hole I am about to share with you all. I also think it is important to know for context that this trip took place exactly 1 week after my girlfriend at the time broke up with me. 5.5 years and she suddenly vanished, pushed away by my deepening investment and involvement with psychedelics. I got to the point where I had no time for her anymore, only time for the pursuit of psychedelic gnosis. It was the only thing I thought about, the only thing I talked about. Due to a bad acid trip in the early days of what was once our quest for psychedelic gnosis, she had stopped tripping. But I did not, and I chalked it up to a difference in character and mental fortitude instead of processing it in a healthy manner, and continued deepening my involvement with them while ignoring her. Finally, she had enough and broke up with me. She broke up with me on a Saturday, and it didn't really click into reality in my brain until Sunday when I returned to campus and she wouldn't talk to me and wasn't around. It also so happened that this week at college, a small package arrived that had been ordered several weeks ago. An ounce of Syrian Rue seeds. Excited, maybe manic even, I dissociated frequently during the week to escape my depression. This tended to take the form of smoking copious amounts of weed and listening to Terence McKenna and Alan Watts while writing or thinking about philosophy. In my mind, I had something grander and more important to tend to than my own problems. I assumed the hyperdimensional entities of the tryptamine trance had removed my ex from my life purpose, as I was on the edge of plunging into the deeper levels of novelty and embeddedness of the psychedelic tryptamine experience. Now, I want to emphasise tryptamine because up to this point, most of my high-dose ego-death level psychedelic experiences were with LSD. I was not particularly experienced with high-dose psilocybin and had not tried DMT yet at this point in my life, so I was very curious and interested in this deeper tryptamine space. It was all that occupied my mind. I had never really had the opportunity to gather enough mushrooms to have a heroic dose, and could not find DMT in those days, so I guess it was a logical leap to conclusion to combine the two together. I briefly read references to something called Psiloaska on DMT Nexus, but couldn't really find much about it, and since I knew it would be unfeasible for me to do anything with the ayahuasca vine itself, I had figured Syrian Rue would make a good substitute. I had read about Syrian Rue very little, only stuff like it would make mushrooms stronger. I remember reading back then that some people on Shroomery saying stuff like it'll make 2 grams of mushrooms feel like 5 or 6 grams. It really seemed like free will, and my ego played little part in me deciding to take this combo, and when I did, oh boy, was I in for something else. It was around 4:30 PM on a Saturday evening when I decided to start the trip. I measured out 1.5 grams of Syrian Rue and took a big swig of orange juice and gulped it down. Alright, it took a couple gulps to get it down, but 1.5 grams of small brown seeds down the hatch, and I sat and waited. I had read on Shroomery that the best way to do the combo was to take the Rue 30 to 45 minutes before taking the shrooms, so that it could get all the way into your gut. So this is what I did, and after a joint and about 20 minutes of meditation I felt a peculiar energy. I felt vibratory and alive. My senses were heightened slightly, as I remember trying to chew up the 2 grams of mushrooms and it being too gross. So I started sipping orange juice, which led to a disgusting orange juice mushroom pulp in my mouth that I forced myself to swallow before I gagged and spat it out. After managing to get the little blue fellows down my throat, I sat and smoked another joint. I noticed it was coming up rather quickly, and that I had an unusual amount of energy, so I got up and went outside. It was a beautiful day in the southeastern United States, and the weather was just a perfect 70-something. A light breeze and wispy cirrus clouds made for a great frolic in the field behind my house. Walking down the tree line, and I just greeted the trees and plants with a pulsating energy and a smile. After a brief little excursion to the edge of the woods behind my house, I returned up the hill to sit down with my pet wolf. Yes, I'm not kidding you, and I'm not crazy. We actually have a pet wolf my family got when I was a 4th grader. She's old and fluffy. And while coming up on mushrooms, nothing is more delightful than to stroke and pet a wolf which behaves like a big puppy. After a short while of just passing time outside and enjoying the come-up, maybe about 45 minutes or so, I start to feel physically beaming. A lot of energy and vitality, but a pretty decent body load. I experience a lot of physical stimulation and arousal, which prompts me to go inside and, oh well, I'm sure you know what I mean. No one needs a bunch of description about that. But after a little bit of fun, not safe for work psychedelic shenanigans, I feel pretty loaded and decide it's time to lay down. Now here's where the good stuff comes in. There's nothing quite like being more loaded than you've ever been in the first hour of a psilocybin trip, and then settling into about the hour and a half mark. But something quite different happened at this point than usual from taking the Syrian Rue. Things began spiralling and spiralling, more and more, faster and faster. The waves of euphoria and ecstasy grew stronger and stronger, getting more and more intense by the second, as eventually things passed into a place of intensity I'd never dealt with before. My thoughts started spiralling. What would my ex think of me now, and what is happening to me? Thoughts of, what is going on? And then finally the classic, something's wrong. Then I got this strange sense of doom or anxiety, a kind of sense of urgency and panic best described as highly existential. That is to say, it somehow began to feel like life or death. The fight or flight response in my brain had been triggered, and I had the feeling of utmost existential panic, like if you had to disarm a bomb while balancing on a wire. The feeling like everything you did, and every single millisecond mattered. No room for even the slightest mistakes. Even the slightest break of focus could spell disaster at this point. I'd become completely overwhelmed, reality ripping away from me in a roaring screech of tryptamine alienness, still impossible to describe. My mind was filled with what can only be described as alien computer sounds, ripping apart reality into visions. My visual field began to overload with visuals, and I could no longer control my eyes. My eye movement at this point had become involuntary, like the rapid eye movement of the dream state. I was dazzled with very complex non-Euclidean geometry. My eyes darted around, and then my right eye began to water severely until I was full out crying, but only out of my right eye. With water pouring out of my right eye, involuntarily blinking and half opening my eyes, I had a bizarre thought that there was the start of a cascade of bizarreness that slowly descended into something that I thought must be akin to schizophrenia. This must signify that I have the eye of Odin. I've lost my right eye. A little background for this next part to make sense. I began going to an eye doctor in high school to see if I potentially had glaucoma, because I had really high intraocular pressure, particularly in my right eye. As I began seeing flashes of visions, they were mainly centered around my right eye, which was closed but sobbing. I see a wood fire burning, with smoke bellowing forth in such a way that the vision of the smoke becomes the tears of my right eye as they meet. Somehow, in the flash of a second, I conceived that the plants were speaking to me telepathically through the vision, to tell me that I could use the smoke from burning wood to heal my right eye. All of a sudden my eyes open, and I can see briefly from my left eye, so I leap forth and grab the stick of Palo Santo which I kept on my dresser next to my bed. Now, I do not condone playing with fire while loaded, but I'll excuse myself because it didn't seem like me that was doing it. It felt like I'd become possessed, and my body movements weren't of my own doing. It was like sleepwalking awake. I lit the Palo Santo, and as it began to smoulder, I held it right under my right eye. I feel like I held it very, very close to my face, and I'm probably lucky I didn't burn myself. But my eyes were both closed, and suddenly I was praying in tongues. Or if you're not familiar with the Bible, I was praying in gibberish. But either way, I had become possessed by the plants, bent over wafting Palo Santo smoke into my right eye, praying in angelic gibberish, and then suddenly the tears stopped. My right eye dried up and I could see out of it finally. A moment of total clarity and I was exalted. I'd realised that the plants had possessed me to perform a miracle on myself to heal my eye. I began sobbing different tears. Tears of joy as I realised somehow that grace had been bestowed upon me, and that the universe had revealed its true magic to me. I had the feeling as though I was sitting in the middle of a giant cathedral, though I've never been in one. I was amazed and mulled it over to myself. Back in my own head I thought, that must be how saints performed miracles in the ancient times. I was amazed, but thoughts of a human kind brought me back to my own reality. I only wish I could have shown this to my ex. Then she'd understand. As I reflected on the glory and how far I had come in my psychedelic pursuits, another wave began to take me. I lay for a little while looking at the vivacity and lucidity of the visuals. lenticular patterns of undulating, non-Euclidean geometric forms that expanded my vision beyond the scope of only 3 dimensions. I reflected on something Terence and Dennis McKenna remarked about at the harmine and psilocybin combo. I began reminiscing about Terence's lectures I had been listening to the week prior. I was having thoughts like, man, now I understand why they call this combo vegetable television. This is so goddamn vivid, it's like I'm looking at a TV behind my eyelids. Holy shit. The visuals, thoughts and feelings proceed to intensify, even stronger than the last wave. At this point, the Rue and mushroom experience does something I'll refer to as memory interference, or the "that's not cool bro" syndrome. This is something that has only ever happened to me once in all my psychedelic experiences, and it's something that I think, if occurred frequently in a person's life, would put them in a mental hospital. But it, for as far as I can tell, put a fake memory in my head. Upon reflecting, it seems like I had remembered a hallucination as though it had actually happened. I had a cognitive hallucination of fully soberly remembering Dennis McKenna saying in one of his bits concerning the experiment at La Chorrera that they had made a near serious mistake in their calculations when preparing the harmine and psilocybin combo they did in the Amazon. That they had taken it just a little bit before sundown, and so put themselves at risk of blindness, because as I had a very clear memory of Dennis saying, "The combo of harmine and psilocybin will enable one to see on all spectrums of light, from the infrared to the UV in one visual field. So it must be taken at night, or you risk permanently burning out your retinas due to the increased photosensitivity." I only concluded that this was a false memory several weeks after this trip, while trying to piece myself back together. I came to this realization on a later LSD trip, where I spent literally 4 or 5 hours straight searching for any trace of Dennis mentioning this anywhere. I was going crazy looking for this, and I could not find a single shred of anything anywhere. I found nothing to the slightest at all that Dennis McKenna came anywhere near saying anything remotely like this, on any written or recorded medium. It is still the single most frightening psychedelic experience I have ever had, to have a false memory implanted in my brain that I thought was completely true for about a month, until I realised it wasn't, in absolute confusion and horror. But in the timeline of my confused mind, I had conceived of this memory as real, and began to panic as my visuals got more and more intense. I knew I had taken it too early for the hopes of sunset to save me, and shutting my curtains wasn't enough to stop the cascade of visuals that were once again overtaking my field of vision and ripping 3D reality away from me. I began to seriously panic at the thought of permanently damaging or losing my sight, and grabbed anything I could to cover my face. After covering my face with my black jacket, I quickly realised that this too was not enough, and began to panic even more. I began trying to completely shield my face from light by stacking blankets and jackets on top of me, until I had achieved enough darkness that I had thought I was safe. Unfortunately, at this same time, I began to freak out. My mum had gotten home from the store. My parents knew I did psychedelics, and while I'm sure no parent loves their son doing drugs, they used to do acid back in the day and they were okay with me tripping. But my mum came in, probably anticipating on making me carry the rest of the groceries in, to burst into my room to discover that not only was I tripping on mushrooms, but I was freaking out and tripping hard. Now, I know no parents want to see their kids on drugs, especially wigging out and not making sense. But please, if anyone who hears this is a parent, do not yell. Do not become irate. You can seriously damage your relationship with your friends, family and loved ones, depending on how you react to finding them in a despondent mental situation on drugs. My mother does quite the opposite of the best and proceeds to yell at me and get angry and storm out the room, slamming the door and stomping outside, cursing and angry. Stomping around and slamming doors and being absolutely useless in her temperament to help me, I begin to get very angry, but in a weird psychedelic lunatic kind of way. I start cursing back at her in my mind and muttering quietly under my breath, except I'm cursing and mumbling in tongues again. Only this time the gibberish was different. It had a sound and a sense to it which gave me the feeling of speaking Hebrew. Even though I don't speak Hebrew and had no clue what was coming out of my mouth, I got the sense that I was cursing my mother in Hebrew. In this insanity I began to mentally dislocate, and somehow find myself in the midst of a cognitive hallucination, where the Rue and mushrooms were telling and showing me that in one of my ancestral lineages I had a long-lost Jewish ancestor. It was some strange hallucination about one of my very great and on down the line grandfathers was a Jew who was unfaithful to his wife, and impregnated a young European girl while having an affair. And something about how I was going to have to atone for his sins as well. At the shock, disbelief and confusion about what I was experiencing, I snapped back into my body to realise that trying to lay under a mountain of blankets and jackets was not feasible and was not helping me out. Still panicked about my sight, I had conceived of the perfect plan. My dad's bedroom was right next to mine and completely blacked out because he works third shift and was sleeping through my insanity and my mother's lack of polity. I got up and stumbled with my hands on the wall, eyes barely functioning, and opened my dad's bedroom door. With my big blanket I plopped down on the floor away from the bed in the corner and tucked myself away into a cocoon. Laying down in his bedroom I began to slide into what definitely felt like and is remembered like a bipolar schizophrenic meltdown. While laying on the floor I acquire this strange sort of physical restlessness and twitch that has me twisting and turning side to side. It's very hard to describe, but I was laying on my back, with my head turning from side to side like I was looking left to right over and over again, like shaking my head repetitively. As I would lean and look to the right I would see paradise, beautiful naked women, jeweled landscapes and stunning hyperdimensional geometry. Then as I would lean to the left, I would gaze into hell. Putrid images of distorted and gnarled flesh, visions of rotting mutilated corpses sewn together with pus that had eyes and gnawing teeth interspersed with patches of a sickly green colour. The dominant colour palette of the heaven realm was pastel. Reds, pinks, oranges, neon blues, purples and stark white lit up the visions of celestial jungles and deep spacecraft civilizations who lived in perfect symbiosis with nature. Then on the other side was black. More shades of black than you could ever imagine. Not grey, there was no grey, but only black onto darker than Vanta black. I did not stare into hell for long periods of time, for the longer I stared the more I realised the abyss truly has no end, and that like light, which can't leave a black hole once trapped, one shouldn't stare all the way into the void. It felt like to look too long would be leaning too far over the edge of a cliff. You'd never recover from it. I cycled through this insanity, jumping from heaven to hell and back at ever faster paces. I began to enter into serious delusions from both sides. Staring into heaven I would see projections of my deepest fantasies like there were other realities already happening. I would see fantasies of me and my ex back together doing things that we never would have done. I saw us travelling all over the world, expounding and glorifying the Rue and mushroom experience like people carried the gospel. On the other hand, I would see demons lurch forth from the dark and jump at me, jumping right up to my face and shrieking and screaming horrible sounds at me. Meanwhile my mind was going berserk with insanities like, Thor must be the true name of God, or no, clearly Shiva is the true name of God, and many more. At some point I remember exclaiming to myself in my head, God is power, God is the mushroom, Thor is power, Thor is the mushroom, Shiva is power, Shiva is the mushroom. I still puzzle to this day why the strange obsession with Thor and Shiva on this trip came about. I wax and wane through heaven and hell faster and faster, churning through the names of God. Meanwhile my thoughts, feelings and visions all start to flow together into one singular experience, where I burst into a space in my mind where I am singing, chanting brilliantly in Mongolian. Now again, I don't speak Mongolian, and have no clue why I thought I was, because even as messed up as I was, no one was going to convince me I'm secretly Mongolian. A long-lost Jew I could believe, but not a long-lost Mongolian. Finally, in the waning of the peak of my psychosis, my dad wakes up and storms out of the room, screaming angry and confused from a bad dream where he thought someone kept calling his phone, so he couldn't sleep. I don't know how I knew that's what I was dreaming once I calmed down, but at this point I was completely out of it, and thought that my dad had just woken up possessed by a demon and was getting ready to go beat my mum to death. Again, panicked with that same fight or flight response, I run into the living room and plop down on my dad, sobbing and hugging to him, to which he replies, as he was sitting down asking my mum who kept calling him all day. Both me and my mum had to reassure him it was a dream and that nobody had been calling him. Then I had told him I was tripping and had crawled into his room. And in fashion with my psychedelic psychosis, I told him that I had brought demons near our house by taking this unholy sacrament of rue and mushrooms together, and that they had been messing with him in his dreams so that he couldn't sleep. He played my psychosis off pretty well with a, "Well, stop doing that then." My dad did a lot of acid back in the day, so I think he knew how to handle me better than my mum, and I immediately felt safer and better in the living room with him. I sat down on the couch and looked at the people on the TV. I don't remember what we were watching, or a lot of what was going on around me at this point in the trip. It had finally become dark outside, so I was no longer worried about losing my sight, and sighed a sigh of relief internally. I immediately became suspicious as to whether or not that was true or a delusion, but still felt too freaked out to know. For all I know, I had narrowly avoided blindness. I sat and was back down to earth for a little bit. I thought, "Phew, thank God that's over, and I'm glad. I don't ever want to go through that again. I don't ever want to do this again. I don't even know if I ever want to trip again, to be honest." I was very depressed, confused and hurt. I lost my ex for this. This is awful. What the hell am I doing? Why am I here? This is what I choose? Why? How? I got dragged out my thought loop when my dad asked me if I wanted to smoke some weed. Weed seemed like a comfort food, like familiar territory. Something that would bring me back to centre and remind me of exactly who I was and what I was doing. Boy, was I wrong again. I took a small toke and thought, "Oh, this tastes nice, this smells good, thank God." And then I took a second bigger, fully sized toke and wound up coughing super hard. I coughed just like I did the very first time I ever smoked weed. It was painful and harsh. It burnt my throat and my lungs and sent me gasping for air, and then suddenly, black. And boom, I fade back in, leaning back in the couch with some more nonsensical thoughts in my head. Did I just die? Did that weed kill me? Have I died smoking weed before? Why do I remember dying from smoking weed? You can't die from smoking weed. No one's ever died from smoking weed. How did I die from smoking it back in high school if I'm here now? Then suddenly it dawned on me. In horror and awe I realised, oh, this is the trip. This is eternity. This is the trip that never ends. This is the psychedelic you take and never come down from. I'm not dead or alive, but this is a dream, and this trip is where I see myself in the dream and then wake up. I had completely conceived that everything since a certain day in high school was a dream, and that I was going to wake up the day before my sophomore year percussion camp in high school. This played off of a running joke I had with my friends from high school drumline, where we would always joke that something crazy would happen, and then we would wake up the morning after our drumline sleepover at my friend's house. Upon reflection, it seems like my ego had no clue what metaphysical reality was real, and that any number of metaphysical ideas could be the absolute truth. I had no clue if the Bible was literally true or not. It seemed equally plausible to me that the last 4 years of my life were just a dream in a night before high school percussion camp, as that I had been chosen out specifically by God Almighty himself to deliver a prophecy about China taking over the world. Being raised in the South, I was very exposed to extreme Christian fundamentalism as a kid, and it definitely left a stain on my ego's ability to process reality in this trip. Strange though was that I never had the concept or hallucination that one could be damned. I seemed to know unquestionably that heaven and hell exist in the human domain of experience, and that human decision either brings people closer to one or the other. I would have waves of equally confident religious fundamentalism in which I felt convinced that I knew that God was real and behind all religions. But then I would become confused and scared when I would see visions of a super advanced technological world where most people looked of Asian origin and seemed to be speaking Chinese, while worshipping artificial life and artificial intelligence. As I began to spiral through more confusion and dread, I began to regress mentally and felt like I was getting younger and younger, so that at some points it felt like I had the mind of a 5-year-old me again. At some point I had gotten up while my parents were getting ready for work, and not paying attention to me, and wandered outside and sat on the cold dark ground and began to have flashbacks of nightmares from childhood. At some point I fully flashed back to a nightmare I had as a kid where I was sitting in my backyard and everyone was dead from warfare and everything was just black and grey. And just like from my nightmare, I would close my eyes and count to 10 to wake up, and boom, I'd wake up. Thinking I was either a 5 or 6-year-old kid again waking up from a bad dream, I walked back into the house to snap back into reality, realising I was 19, on terrible drugs, and extremely depressed about my ex leaving me. Coming back to reality for a minute gave me enough time to use the bathroom and to gather a few moments of, what the fuck is going on, before heading to lay in my bed to be hit with what I call the death breaths. The death breaths are this strange experience which seems like the rebooting of your entire identity and memory structure, where you cycle through different states of mind as you breathe in and out. It's as though every time you breathe in, you take in awareness, and every time you breathe out, you die. And slowly as each breath gets deeper, each moment of consciousness coupled with the breath becomes more aware. Then you die as you breathe out each time, so that each breath you take gets deeper and longer, because as you become more and more aware, you become more and more afraid of the feeling of letting go and breathing out. This progressed, leading me through being a baby, taking me through many forgotten memories, interspersed with the feeling of dying, until you come back to your true waking ego consciousness. Thankfully and finally, I lay through this enough to come back down enough to know who I am and what timeline I am in. I come down enough to fall asleep eventually and live the rest of my life trying to unravel what happened to me that night. I have discussed this quality of high-dose tryptamines in another trip report that I submitted to Blurry's YouTube channel, big up my man Blurry, called Peganum Harmala, Mushrooms and DMT. I highly recommend you check it out as it is really a sequel to this experience, seeing as how it was my second time combining harmine and psilocybin. I don't know how they possessed me to take DMT on top of that, but they did, and so I definitely recommend looking up my other trip report if you like this one, as it deals with the same themes and dives even deeper into the madness that was possessing my mind during this time in my life. I definitely didn't stop tripping after this. I actually started tripping more very soon after it because it was a summer break. In trying to unravel what happened to me, remember it, write about it and process it, I started to trip about every 3 or so days during that summer leading up to my big experience with Rue, mushrooms and DMT. And that was the culmination of a serious period of involvement with psychedelics and the work of Terence McKenna that has given me enough to think about for a lifetime.